Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Astronomy on Tap State College. I'm Arvind Gupta, and together with my co-hosts, Brianna and Steve, we run AOT. So for this evening's event, for those of you that are tuning in for the first time or that just need a quick refresher, the way this works is we will kick things off with a short drink cocktail tutorial with Brianna Zawadzki. After that, we will have our first speaker, which is Nate Stewart, and Nate will be talking to us about astronauts on board the ISS. We will follow that up with a set of questions from our host team as well as from you, the audience. So if you have questions for Nate, please post them in the YouTube chat. After that, Steve will give us some astro-themed trivia. That trivia will, you will participate in that. We won't share the answers, though, until after the second talk, which will be Kyle Batra talking about the interiors of exoplanets. After Kyle's talk, Steve will share the trivia answers, and then we will call it a night. So, without further ado, I hope you all enjoy the show, and I will hand it off to Brianna for the drink tutorial.
Awesome. Thanks, Arvind. So for this month's drink, I decided to lean into the astronaut theme a little bit because of Nate's talk. And so I found a cocktail from Trisha Yearwood of the Food Network called the Buzzed Aldrin, named for the very well-known astronaut. And the reason that it's named after Buzz Aldrin is because this drink features Tang, the orange-flavored drink powder. So without further ado, I forgot to mention that Tang was used on a lot of NASA missions, and that's why it's relevant. So Tang was on, I think, the Mercury and Gemini missions. Buzz was a part of the Gemini mission. So here's the Buzz Aldrin. So first things first, you're going to grab your glass, and you're going to add a heaping tablespoon of Tang to your glass. The original recipe called for 2 tablespoons of Tang, but I thought that was quite a lot. So if you have a sweet tooth, you might want to add more, but I'm going to stick with the 1 tablespoon. Go ahead and add 2 ounces of your choice of rum or vodka. I'm going with rum because it was left over from last month's AOT drink, if you were here. All right, so that's 2 ounces of the rum. Go ahead and add 1/2 ounce of Grenadine. Again, if you like it more sweet, you can add more if you want, but I think this is definitely enough. And then you're going to need to mix it pretty thoroughly so that all the powder dissolves. Looks like it's mostly mixed now. I need to grab my ice cubes real fast. And I'm going to add some ice cubes to the glass. Put a lemon slice in the middle and a few more ice cubes. And then you'll just top the whole thing off with club soda. So there you have it. This is the Buzzed Aldrin, and you can enjoy Tang in your drinks just like the astronauts did.
Thank you, Brianna. Got my drink here. So Nate, I'm going to ask you to turn your video on and start sharing your screen. Awesome. So this is Nate Stewart. Nate works at NASA Johnson, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Awesome. And he's going to tell us about astronauts and planning a day on board the ISS. So with that, Nate, I will let you take it away.
I didn't have any Tang on hand, so I chose a space-themed beer instead, but the Tang drink looks delicious. I'll have to try that later. This is the astronaut secretary planning a day on board the ISS. So a quick overview of the presentation. First, we'll go to space and we'll talk about what a nominal workday looks like on board the ISS. We'll also talk about exercise scheduling. That's one of the big hangups for planners. And then we'll also talk about what a nominal weekend looks like. Then we'll kind of bring it back down to earth, and we'll talk about how we actually build the plans. And we'll kind of go through these checkpoints that we go through in our planning process, all the way from the OOS, which is 6 months out, all the way down to real time. I apologize in advance. This talk is going to be full of acronyms. NASA loves acronyms. So if I mention something and you don't know what it is, call me out on it afterwards and I'll fill you in. Quote, because I don't think any presentation is complete without a quote. So plans are nothing, planning is everything, by Dwight D. Eisenhower. So I chose this picture to start off because it shows exactly how crowded we can get on the space station. This was taken earlier this spring. This was during the Crew 1, Crew 2 SpaceX handover. So we had 11 people on board and they lined up in nice rows for us. The back row is Crew 2, who's currently on board. Middle row is the Soyuz crew, who's also currently on board. And then the first row is Crew 1, and they're back here on Earth now. But for about 2 weeks, we had all of them on there. And the ISS is only about a pressurized volume of six-bedroom house. So you can imagine with 11 people, it gets pretty cramped. Not to mention each one of them has to do 2.5 hours of exercise every day. And we only have about 3 modules for the USOS crew to really do experiments in. And in this picture, only 2 people are not USOS. We have 2 Russians in the middle row. The rest are NASA crew members. So we have to try to make sure that they are not conflicting with each other when they're doing experiments, when they're doing operations, maintenance activities, or exercise. So you can imagine that it gets pretty difficult to make sure that everyone is moving exactly where they need to be and not stepping on each other's toes. This next picture, complicated, there's a lot going on. This is an actual timeline that the astronauts would see on board the ISS. And this is also what the rest of the flight control team would look at. So I'm an ops planner, which is one of the flight control disciplines. There's about a dozen or so disciplines. And this is what the rest of them look at when they want to see what's happening on the timeline. So the big points to take away right now are that each one of these rows is a crew member up until you get to the bottom where it says hands off FSL. Those are ground bands. There's like 30 more of those, not important for this talk. But all the things with the fun colors, those are all crew member bands for one work day. So you can see that the workday is pretty darn full. We don't give them a whole lot of downtime. And then you can also see that something else important to note is the first row, that's the commander of the ISS. And the second 2 rows, you notice that they don't have any pink text, it's all black text, and a lot of it's in Russian. Those are those 2 Russian crew members. So we don't really do much with the Russian crew member activities on our end. We let the Russian planners handle most of that. But the rest of this is our domain to take care of. So to help explain a little bit, we'll talk about the nominal workday first. Nominal workdays are usually full of science, a lot of science. That's the main reason we have the ISS. And since we finished building it in 2011, that has been the main focus of the ISS. Maintenance activities are also something we spend a lot of time doing. It's 20 years old and it's not getting any younger. So it takes a lot of upkeep to keep that thing flying. Conferences, we have lots of daily conferences. And then, of course, we have exercise, 2.5 hours per crew member. So there's a lot of exercise happening. And it's important to note that none of these activities are owned by the House Plan Group. So if we go back, each block is a separate activity. None of those are owned by us. So we have to integrate and communicate with the activity owners to figure out exactly when those activities need to be scheduled, who they need to be scheduled on. Are there timing constraints? Are there any constraints with exercise or undocks or something like that we need to work out, and we need to pull that relevant information from the flight control team so we can schedule a successful plan. Let's see, so our daily requirements. So if we took everything off the plan and we just had bare bones, we would have to have 8 hours of sleep, that's required, 1 hour of midday meal, that's lunchtime, and that has to happen between 12 and 14:30. We need an hour and a half of post-sleep. This is basically their wake-up time. After they wake up, they have an hour and a half to, get some coffee, use the bathroom, brush their teeth, take a baby wipe shower because you can't actually shower in space. We have similar time before they go to bed. We call that pre-sleep, and that's 2 hours. So that's eating dinner, that's kind of decompressing, putting things away, getting comfortable and getting into their bunks, and kind of just decompressing from the day. Again, I mentioned that 2.5 hours of exercise, which we'll go into more detail later. They have 6.5 hours of work time. Nominally, we schedule them 6.5 hours of crew time. And what we consider crew time are mostly activities. If you look back at this, things like midday meal and the exercises, those don't count as crew time, as well as sleeping, obviously, and the post-sleep, pre-sleep don't count as crew time either. Then conferences, we have some conferences that we have every day. That's morning DPC and evening DPC. DPC is a daily planning conference, and it's basically just a tag up we have at the beginning of the day and the end of the day with the crew and the flight control team, so we can figure out, we can let them know what they have coming up and what they need to be aware of. And then at the end of the day, they can let us know how the day went, if anything was broken, if anything went long, if they couldn't find a tool, if there's something that we need to fix going forward. So to better understand the plan, sequence colors, we use sequence colors to group related activities. So if you go down here, the sequenced activities are these orangish brownish activities, starting with SIG egress. Everything on this plan that has that color is related in some way to that activity. And so this is important so the crew can know that, hey, I might be finished with this activity, but I have something similar coming up, which is probably going to be in the same location and need the same tools. So I don't want to totally clear up my workspace because I'm going to come back to this. Or, hey, look, FE17 is also going to be on the same activity that I'm on, so I want to make sure that I have things ready for them and I have space for them, and I'm prepared for them to come over and help when it's their time. You'll notice we have several sequence colors. We have yellow activities, light blue activities, purple activities, green activities on here. We also have some red activities. Those are actually not a sequence color. Red simply means the activity isn't ready. So that means that there's something missing from the activity, which means it's not ready to be executed at this time. Usually that's a procedure or something isn't linked, or there's some note in the activity that needs to be added that we haven't figured out yet. Once it's ready to go, then we'll make it either white, or if it's sequenced like these EVA tool activities, then they'll become green and ready to go. Activities with pink names are flexible, so those can be done whenever the crew wants to do them, as long as they have an open block of time. And black name activities are hard scheduled, so they pretty much have to be done exactly as they're scheduled, unless the crew gets prior approval. With flexible activities, they don't need to get approval if they want to start a little bit later, a little bit earlier. And so you see that most of the exercise has pink text. The post-sleep, obviously, the pre-sleep, the prep works, those kind of things all have pink. So those can be done kind of whenever the crew has time to do them, as long as it's not conflicting with another activity. And you'll notice that the majority of the activities all have black text. And so those need to be done basically when we say that they need to be done. Finally, blue boxed activities are time critical and they cannot move. Even if the crew wants to move them and ask for permission, we cannot move them. This is often due to comm coverage. So conferences, morning DPC, evening DPC, PAO events, that's public affairs office events. So that's when the astronauts are talking to a classroom of school children or to the vice president or to Fox News or whatever. We can't move those activities. And then also activities that require ground support. So some experiments will have the PD enabled on a space to ground channel so that they can actually, the lead investigator can actually talk to the astronaut while the astronaut's completing their experiment in case the astronaut has any questions or any hangups or needs to relay any information to the person who's actually in charge of the experiment. So I'll give you a few moments to just look over this again now that you kind of have a better sense of what's going on here. And I will point out that these top kind of blue bands where we have GMT time and Central Time, the ISS runs on GMT time. So that's why that's our main band and that's what we follow. And then we have Central Time up there because Houston's in Central Time. So we want to know when these activities are happening with regards to our shift times. Viewer, this whole thing is completely customizable. So the Europeans in Munich, they can put in their local time as well and see when things are happening with their schedule. And it's also interesting to note with GMT time here in Houston, the astronauts are waking up around midnight and going to bed around 3 p.m., which is something people don't realize, that it's not, they don't really follow our day here in the US. So I said I was going to talk about exercise. Here we go. We have to do 2.5 hours a day. It's important because the microgravity environment causes bone density loss and muscle mass loss. And if you just spend a few days up there, it's not a big deal. It doesn't happen that fast. But over a long time scale of 6 months to a year, which is how long most of our crew members spend up there, you can have severe loss of muscle mass and bone density, which could cause a lot of problems when you come back to Earth. A lot of times the landings are a little bit impactful. It's like being in a low-grade car crash at like 30 miles an hour. And it's designed for that, but they still get a bit of a jolt. So you could break bones during the landing. You could break bones trying to pull them out of the capsule. When they get back to Earth, they're typically very dizzy and they fall down a lot, so they could be at risk for injury there. So we make sure that they're exercising and putting stress on their bones, their joints, and their muscles, so that it's continually, their bodies are continually building it up. So when they come back to Earth, they're strong enough to perform regular functions and they're healthy. Those 2.5 hours are broken up into 1 hour of cardio per day and 1 hour of strength training per day. So the cardio, we have two options. We have the Cevis, which is a bike, and T2, which is a treadmill. Cevis, the bike, is over here in the left lower corner. That's Alexander Gerst on our bike. You'll notice it doesn't look much like a bike here on Earth, except for the fact that he is strapped into some pedals down there by his feet. Other than that, there's hardly anything that makes it look like a bike. There's no seat, there's no handlebars, because you don't need that kind of stuff in microgravity. You just float there and move your feet. There is a backrest for them to push up against, though. And then in the top corner here, we have our T2, or I'm sorry, our ARED. And that's the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. And that's how they weightlift on board station. It's pretty customizable. You can configure it to do a ton of different activities. It's kind of like a space Bowflex. And you can also change the weight load from, I think, like 0 to 450 pounds or something. So you can get a huge range of exercises using that device. And again, they don't get any days off. This happens weekdays and weekends, 2.5 hours every single day, every crew member. Our T2 is my favorite one because it's actually mounted on the wall. So if you were standing or floating in the ISS and you were oriented in the way that you would be oriented on Earth, you would actually see them running on the side of the wall here. It looks kind of, they do have a strap that holds them down, a harness that holds them down so that they can get some load on their feet and their legs while they're running. That's adjustable as well. It's also called the Colbert. I think back when he was running the Colbert Report, NASA had a contest to name the new exercise device, and he got all of his fans to write in and vote for him, and so it ended up being named the Combined Operational Load-Bearing External Resistive Treadmill. NASA will make any acronym work if we enjoy the acronym enough. And so that's an actual patch and plaque they have for the T2. I think T2 actually just stands for treadmill 2. I think it was the second one that they sent up. So a much less boring acronym. A nominal weekend plan is much simpler than a week plan. We try to give the crew 2 off-duty days a week. We try to make them consecutive, if at all possible. Sometimes a vehicle is docking or undocking on a Saturday, or maybe a spacewalk's happening, and then they have to work that day. So we'll try to give them maybe a Sunday, Monday off, or at the very least, an off-duty day somewhere in the next week. These plans really just need sleep, pre-sleep, post-sleep, same amount of times, midday meal, same amount of time, and the 2.5 hours of exercise. On Saturday, they do cleaning. They clean the station about 2 hours per crew member every week. It seems like a lot, but it's a fairly small space again, with a lot of people living in it. And you notice the dirt and the dust a lot more when it's floating around and it's not settling down onto the floor or into the cracks. We also do a lot of family conferences and free time on these days, so they can watch football, they can watch movies, they can stare out the window, they can do whatever they feel like. So now we're gonna take it from the space station and kind of come back down to Earth. We're gonna talk about how we actually create the plans here. So the first thing to know is the overall structure of the ops plan group. So we're in charge of all the plans. What we have kind of at the forefront, the arrowhead, is the LOP, which is our lead ops plan. And this person will work in 3-month shifts, basically, as being the leader of the group and making sure that everything with the plan is happening as it should be on board. Pretty much everything goes through them. We work 3 months because an increment is 6 months. And that's how long the crew is usually on board for. But it's such a stressful job that 6 months would burn people out. So we do half increments and you hand over mid increment to the next lot. After that, we have ops plan, and those people are front room certified. So if you ever watch NASA TV or Apollo 13 or something, and you see them in that big room, with a whole bunch of rows of people and computer screens and big screens in the front, that's the front room. We call that the FICR. And that's where the ops plan console is the main ops plan person. They work up front there. Rippy is their real-time planning engineer, and it's basically the assistant to ops plan. They work in a back room. And then we have STP and WLP, short-term planner, weekly look-ahead planner, and they work in another back room, and they're looking further out on the timeline. Some of the tools we use: Optimus Viewer. This is a visual of the plan, and this is the screenshot I showed you guys earlier. That's a viewer plan. Score is what the ops plan group actually uses to create the plans. It allows us to move the activities around, add and delete things, and edit tons of different options with activities. And then from there, we kind of publish out a static version to Viewer for the flight control team and the astronauts to look at. So Viewer, you can't move or change anything, but Score, you can do all that stuff. And then PBCR is our planning product change request, and this is used in our real-time period to track changes to the plan. So our plans kind of start 6 months out here with the OOS, and they move up through. We use this E- notation. That just means execution minus 6 months. So E minus 6 months is 6 months in the future. E minus 0 is today and the day it's being executed. So now we'll kind of walk through the timeline of creating a plan. So what we start with is our long range planning. And this starts about 6 months before the increment actually starts. We create this thing called an OOS. It's the on-orbit operations summary. And it contains lists of activities for each day of your increment. So for your 3-month time frame that you're locked, you have every single day laid out with activities listed of what you want to do that day. And it's not on a timeline. It's kind of just in like an Excel spreadsheet sort of thing. But we work up to the amount of crew time. So we have 6.5 hours of crew time, multiply that by however many crew you have, and that's how much activity space you're trying to fill on each day. This is created with a lot of input from our international partners, from Marshall Space Flight Center, who's not international, JAXA, ESA, the Russians, and we actually used to travel before COVID we would have it in Munich, we would have it in Houston, and we would have it in Moscow, I think. We would rotate, and everyone would come together and help put this thing together. And we also work with the ISS program management to do that as well. So from OOS, we jump ahead to E minus 2 weeks, so just 2 weeks ahead. This is our weekly look ahead plan. This is the first time the activities get laid out on a timeline, so we take them out of that spreadsheet kind of thing. We actually start laying them out, seeing what crew member they can work on, what the timing constraints are. We have 2 planners that do this every week. Those planners rotate. You usually have a few weeks on console and then a week or 2 off, back on and off. This takes a lot of coordination with Marshall Space Flight Center because we're laying out all those payload activities for the first time, and the international partners for any activities that they own. And this position, you only support orbit 2 shift, which is O2, which is fancy NASA way of saying like the regular shift from 7:30 to 3:30. We have orbit 1, which is like midnight to 7 or so, midnight to 8. Orbit 2, 8 to 4, and then orbit 3, 4 to midnight. I don't know why we call them orbits. I guess it's just a NASA thing. From LRP, long range planning, and WLP, we go to our short-term plan, which is 1 week out. And so this has worked a little bit differently. In WLP, they work the whole week at once. In this time frame, you're really just working 2 days at a time. So you'll have a planner who's working the E minus 7 day, or a planner who's working the E minus 6 day, and then you'll have a lead planner who's kind of looking at the whole week, who has a bit more experience that's helping guide those planners that are working the 1 day thing. So you'll work 1 day for 2 days, which is confusing, but it'll make sense in the next slide. This is also the first cert for planners, so this is where you start out. And again, it's an orbit 2 thing. And to kind of explain how we tackle these plans, we have this little table. So for most of the week, there's 2 planners. On Monday, the first planner will prelim Monday, which is E minus 7. And the other planner will finalize Sunday, which is E minus 6. And on Tuesday is now E minus 7. So the planner who was finalizing E minus 6 jumps to that E minus 7 and starts prelimming that. And the person who was prelimming the E minus 7 the day before starts finalizing what is now the E minus 6, because time keeps marching on. On Thursday and Friday, we have a third planner come in, and we just call them the weekend planner, even though they plan Friday and Saturday. So that brings us to real-time planning. So the plan is almost ready to be executed. And this is handled by two main people, Ops Plan and Rippy. You can tell just from these pictures which one is more exciting to work. Obviously, Ops Plan has all the cool screens, and they're sitting in the front room and they have to wear a tie and look nice. And sometimes people will come in with cameras and you'll be on live TV. Sometimes VIPs will come through. I know someone met Garth Brooks the one time they were working on there. One of our planners met Ariana Grande and is actually on her Instagram story still. Whereas Rippy, everyone forgets about you, even though you're doing a lot of the same work. You're in a much more boring office setting, although you do have like 6 screens to work with. So that's kind of cool. So during real time, which is E-3 through E-0, all of our changes, again, have to be documented through PBCR. So if you want to make a change to the plan, you have to submit this electronic document that lays out what you want to change on the plan and why you want to change it. The flight director also has to approve all the changes at this point. Up until now, you could just kind of email a planner and we would make it we would change the plan. No big deal. But at this point, everything needs to go through flight and everything needs to be documented for full transparency in case something were to go wrong or slip through the cracks. We can track back why that issue actually occurred. Ops Plan, again, front room certified. When they're on console, they answer to the flight director because there's a flight director sitting pretty much right behind them, and they are in charge of the front room whenever they're working a shift. They also support every single shift, so we always have an ops planner on console, although on the weekends, we will often take them on call for Orbit 1s. Rippy, basically ops plan assistant. They work in the MIPSR, which is one of our back rooms, one of our less interesting back rooms, if I'm honest. And they support Orbit 2 and Orbit 3 shifts. And at this point, you're not like replanning the day or making huge changes. You're really just talking to all the other disciplines and making sure that everything looks good to be executed within the next day, the next 2 days, the next 3 days, and coordinating any changes that need to happen. And so at that point, we've gone through a brief overview of how we plan, what the plans look like. And so I'm happy to answer any questions at this point that you guys may have.
All right, thank you, Nate. I think my main takeaway from that is that y'all use a lot of acronyms that were not super easy to follow. And if I want to go to the front room, I just need to be as famous as Ariana Grande.
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
How it goes, yeah. Our favorite joke is that for the first 6 months of working at NASA, you're just learning acronyms. Like the first month that you're there, you'll go to meetings and you will not understand anything. It all goes over your head. And slowly you start to pick up on what everything is.
Okay. So we have a few questions from the chat and also some questions from us. I will kick things off with, so while you're doing all this work, what's the most interesting experiment or activity that you've had to help the astronauts plan for on board the ISS?
Yeah, that's a good question. Done a lot. We did when we worked with I think we had a spacewalk for the AMS, the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer. That was pretty cool because that was newsworthy and it got a lot of attention. Personally, what I've done is I made a slip plan, which is a plan for if an undock or a launch shifts. I got to do the slip plans for Crew 1, SpaceX, and Crew 2. And that's like a new vehicle, a very exciting time of bringing a lot of crew members up. And so for Crew 1, they actually used my slip plan. So when they docked and got there and everything, those were the activities that I had spent 2 weeks laying out pretty much by myself on the timeline as a slip planner. So that was a pretty special moment for me.
That's pretty cool, actually. Wow. Yeah. All right. So next, it seems we have a lot of questions about sleep schedules, which probably shows where our priorities are. So the first one is, do all of the crew go to bed and wake up at the same time, or are they staggered such that somebody's always awake and able to monitor things?
So nominally, they all go to sleep at the same time and wake up at the same time. We'll occasionally do sleep shifts if we have a vehicle that's docking at a weird time or they're leaving at a weird time or something like that. We'll have them maybe sleep longer or go to sleep earlier. But a common misconception with the ISS is that the astronauts are in charge of it, and they're really not. They're just passengers. It's completely controlled by the ground. So Mission Control, Houston and in Moscow, are watching the station while they're asleep. If there's any alarms that trip, we're the first ones that know about it. Of course, they'll go off on the station and the astronauts will wake up, call us, and figure out what's going on. But we're really monitoring the station 24/7.
Okay. So I guess another one then is that, do the astronauts, are they all actually able to stick to this, the proper pre-sleep, 8 hours of sleep and post-sleep, or do some of them have, I don't know, trouble sleeping or sleep in or anything like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of them will have trouble sleeping. Again, these people are like, a lot of like Navy SEALs and military trained, so they can sleep anywhere that you give them time to sleep. But we do offer some light sleep aids. We can't give them anything that'll like really knock them out in case an alarm or an emergency would happen. They have to wake up quick and be, in the right frame of mind to work an emergency. But we do give them light sleep aids, and most of them are able to stick to it. Some of them are really early risers. And so we had one guy a few months ago who would just wake up like 2 hours early and just do his exercise then, which was awesome because it made it a lot easier for us to schedule exercise later in the day for everyone else then.
Okay, so they don't always all have to get that 8 hours then.
Yeah, we give them that time. They can use it however they want.
That's cool. All right, so I guess from that, do the astronauts have the option of like giving feedback or input on the schedules you give them, or is it sort of like you give them the schedule, they do it?
No, they give us a lot of feedback. So at those DPC, the daily planning conferences, they'll give us a lot of feedback, especially in the evening ones, and they'll say, hey, this activity was scheduled for 2.5 hours, but it really took 3. So next time you put that on the schedule, give it to me for 3. Before they even go up, they give us exercise preferences of some people want to do cardio first, and then weightlifting, and they always want to do it in the morning as close to breakfast. And some people want them staggered throughout the day. Some people want it at the end of the day. So we do our best to meet those preferences as well, and then take any crew feedback that we get. Also, after they finish an increment and they're back on the ground, we do a whole debrief where we talk about how the planning went for the increment, and if there were things they liked, they didn't like, they want us to change, suggestions. We take all that from the crew and we work on it, and we try to improve constantly.
Okay. So you talked a bit about, if an emergency happens when they're sleeping, how you guys handle it. But in general, if there are emergencies, do you have like various contingency plans in place? So, Okay.
Yeah, there's tons of contingencies for fire has its own special set of contingency plans. An ammonia leak, that's the worst thing that could happen on board because that would get mixed in with the oxygen, and you have minutes to get your PBA on, your breathing apparatus on, and get to a safe part of the station, lock down one of the airlocks, and probably get to your vehicle and just leave at that point. But yeah, there's tons of different contingency procedures, and the crew spends hours upon hours training those. To get a crew ready to fly is probably like 1.5 years of training, and that's something that they're constantly doing. We actually have a full mock-up of the ISS here in Houston, and they will fill it up with smoke and run an alarm, and then the crew has like 3 minutes to get everything done that they need to do, and that's one of the ways that they train.
Nice. So I think a little while back, we have a question here about some air leaks on the ISS. Were you involved at all in the planning for that and how that worked out?
Yeah, so there was a leak on a Soyuz capsule. So that was really largely a Russian thing that they figured out. I mean, we worked together, but in the planning community, we didn't have a whole lot to do with that. There was a lot of analysis going on with like Ethos, who's in charge of the air quality and pressure and everything in station. But they did a Russian EVA, and they were largely in charge of that. We had another one recently where we did have some planning constraints. I forget where the leak ended up being, but it was multiple weekends in a row where we would basically lock down half of the ISS and put the entire crew in the other half. And then we would just check the air pressure over 2 days' time and see if it went down or up to try and locate exactly what module this air leak was in. And I think they ended up, I forget how it was some ridiculous way they ended up finding the air leak. I forget if they like put a tissue up there or something and then closed it down and like watched where it moved. It was something utterly ridiculous that like you couldn't believe that they were solving space problems like this, but it works because you're really just tracking the airflow.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions we had for you. Thanks so much for coming on. That was a really great talk. Hope you're enjoying your beer there.
Yeah, I am. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome, cool. Thanks, Nate. So Steve, if you want to come in now and get the trivia all ready to go. Have you put the trivia link in the chat yet?
I did, yes. I'm about to share.
Awesome, great. In that case, I will hand it off to you then.
All right, can you see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Like Arvin mentioned, hi, I'm Steve. I'm one of the organizers, and tonight we'll be playing trivia as usual. Our topic today is going to be vintage rocketry and the space race. So kind of going back through the history of the past 100 years, looking at how rocketry has developed, the early space programs, and then some iconic stories from the time past. Like I mentioned, the link to play is a Google form. I pasted it in the chat down there. The prizes for our lucky winner today include what you see here: masks, beer koozies, bottle openers, etc. The winner will contact afterwards, so be sure to add your email. And just a reminder, if there's a tie between two teams and two teams get the same number of questions, the one with the best astronomy themed name will win the tiebreaker. So be sure to include interesting astronomy theme names. This is a multiple choice question quiz, so it's pretty simple. First, I'll read the question and then the 4 answers. The questions are pretty straightforward. For example, this one, the answer is obviously up. Rockets go up after they launch. You can see a funny Onion article here satirizing that. So without further ado, let's jump into our 15 questions and see how we fare at trivia tonight. Question number 1 is, in the seminal early science fiction story From the Earth to the Moon, Jules Verne posits a voyage to the moon via a large cannon. Where does he prophetically locate the cannon? Is that in Texas, Kazakhstan, Florida, or French Guiana? Where does Jules Verne put this fictitious cannon that launches a cannonball to the moon? Question number 2. NASA named a famous facility after this 20th century engineer and inventor who is credited with building the precursor to modern liquid-fueled rockets. Is that Robert H. Goddard, Samuel Langley, Lyndon B. Johnson, or George Marshall? What's the name of the engineer and inventor? You can see him here to the right, pictured with one of his early rockets. Question 3. The US space program was kick-started when over 1,600 German scientists were moved to the US after World War II. What was the code name of this program? Was it Operation Declutter, Operation Overlord, Operation Paperclip, or Operation Ratline? What was the name of this program to move scientists? Question 4. Though he was a pivotal figure in NASA's early history, why has the legacy of Werner von Braun been reevaluated and criticized in recent times? Was it A, his work on nuclear weapons, B, his use of slave labor at concentration camps, C, his collaboration with Joseph McCarthy during the Red Scare, or is it D, his construction of the V-2 retribution weapon ballistic missile? Why has his legacy been reevaluated and criticized? Question 5, before he became a leading Soviet rocket designer, how did Sergei Korolev spend World War II years from 1938 to 44? Was it A, he built ballistic missiles for the Soviet Air Force, B, he served in the Soviet Army, C, he was imprisoned in a Gulag labor camp in Siberia, or D, he worked as an elementary school teacher? How did Sergei Korolev spend his time before becoming a rocket scientist? Number 6, Sergei Korolev is the chief designer of the R7 ICBM with the iconic Korolev Cross booster separation. You can see an animation of it here in a recent launch. Under what name does this rocket family currently fly almost 60 years after it first flew? Is it Proton, Saturn, Molniya, or Soyuz? Question 7. The Mercury Redstone 1 mission is viewed as one of the most embarrassing failures of early American spaceflight. How far did the rocket get off the launch pad? Was it 4 miles, 400 feet, 4 feet, or 4 inches? How far did the Mercury Redstone 1 mission get off the launch pad? Next, the Soviet Union made history with the launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957. The follow-up launch of Sputnik 2 in 58 sent what animal into orbit? Was that a monkey named Gordo, a rat named Hector, a dog named Laika, or a turtle named Esmeralda? What animal did Sputnik 2 launch into orbit? Question 9. Sally Ride was the first American woman to go to space on Challenger in 1983. What other historic first does she hold in space travel? The first woman on the moon, the first deaf astronaut, the first LGBT astronaut, or the first docking between 2 vessels in space? What other historic first does Sally Ride have? Next, question 10. Why did Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space and pilot of Vostok 1 1961, demand to replace another cosmonaut, Vladimir Komarov, in the Soyuz 1 mission of 1967? Was it because he wanted to create an internationally embarrassing incident for the USSR? He was jealous of Komarov, who had surpassed Gagarin's record of time in space? Was it because he thought the spacecraft was deadly and error-prone, and he was hoping the flight would get canceled? Or was it because he wanted to be the first person to dock 2 spacecraft in orbit? Why did Gagarin try and replace Komarov on the Soyuz 1 mission? Question 11. The end of the space race was followed by several collaborations between American and Soviet and Russian programs in the decades since. Which one of these is not one such program that happened? The Gemini Salyut Rendezvous project, the Apollo Soyuz test project, the Shuttle Mir program, or the International Space Station? Which one of these is not a collaboration between American and Soviet or Russian programs? Number 12, as the United States pursued the Space Shuttle program, the Soviet Union poured resources into a visually similar Buran orbiter. What caused the cancellation of the Buran program? You can see it here pictured on the right. Was it the orbiter wings kept falling off? Was it the collapse of the Soviet Union? Was it the Challenger disaster? Or was it delays in the Energia carrier rocket? What caused the Buran program to be canceled? Now for some more humorous stories of early space travel. In 1965, astronaut John Young was reprimanded upon his return to Earth for smuggling what aboard the Gemini 3 mission? Did he smuggle his pet mouse, a copy of Das Kapital by Karl Marx, a cigar, or a corned beef sandwich? What did John Young smuggle aboard his space flight? Number 14, ever since Yuri Gagarin's historic flight in 61, astronauts launching from Baikonur, the Russian launch site, partake in pre-launch traditions to commemorate his routine, including all of the following except planting a tree on the Avenue of the Cosmonauts, watching the Russian historical epic White Sun of the Desert, attending a mass at a Russian Orthodox church, or urinating on the back tire of the bus to the launch site. Which one of these traditions do astronauts not partake in before launching from the Russian launch site? And finally, our last question, the first American space station, Skylab, was visited by 3 crews. What did the second crew leave as a joke to scare the third crew? Did they leave a dozen empty bottles of vodka set up to look like a college frat party? Did they leave a rubber snake in the sleeping closet? Did they leave fake spiders in the vacuum toilet? Or did they leave mannequins dressed in flight suits and the third crew mistook those for Soviet invaders? What did the second Skylab crew leave as a joke to scare the third crew? All right, just very briefly, I'll go back and run through all the questions one by one. Make sure you get your answers in and submitted before Brianna finishes astronomy in the news. So first, second, who is the engineer and inventor? Third, what was the name of the operation that jump-started the space program? Fourth, why has Wernher von Braun's legacy been reevaluated? Next, how did Sergei Korolev spend the few years before he became the Soviet rocket scientist? Next, what is the name of the rocket family that is descended from the famous R7 ICBM? How far off the launch pad did the Mercury Redstone 1 mission get? What animal was sent into orbit during the Sputnik 2 launch? What other historic first does Sally Ride hold besides being the first American woman in space? Why did Yuri Gagarin try to replace Vladimir Komarov on the Soyuz 1 mission? Which one of these is not a collaboration between American and Soviet or Russian space programs? Why was the Soviet space shuttle called Buran canceled? What was astronaut John Young reprimanded for smuggling aboard his Gemini 3 mission? And finally, two more, excuse me. Which of these is not a tradition that astronauts do before launching from a Russian launch site? And finally, what did the Skylab 2 crew leave to scare the third crew arriving at the station shortly afterwards? All right, once again, be sure to get your answers in before the end of Astronomy in the News, which Brianna will share momentarily.
All right, let me just get this shared. There we go. All right, so welcome back to another month of Astronomy in the News. Today we are shifting gears away from the talks, which are about astronauts and exoplanets, and we're talking about neutron star black hole mergers. So first, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about LIGO to start. LIGO stands for Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. You may have heard of it before. Its purpose is to detect gravitational waves, and it's already detected several black hole mergers in its lifetime. It has 2 locations, one in Louisiana and one in Washington. And here's a picture of the Louisiana location viewed from above. The other observatory you need to know about is Virgo. Virgo is another gravitational wave observatory. It's also detected several black hole mergers, just like LIGO. And Virgo is a collaboration between Italy, France, the Netherlands, Poland, Hungary, and Spain. But the facility is located in Italy. And here we have a picture of a scientist working on one of the mirrors in Virgo. And so LIGO and Virgo are part of a collaboration with another observatory called CAGRA. They all form a gravitational wave network together. CAGRA is a Japanese gravitational wave observatory, and the reason I am glossing over that one and went a little bit more into depth with LIGO and Virgo is just because CAGRA was actually offline during the discoveries I'm about to talk about. So it's not super relevant here, but it is part of the network. A few additional notes before we get to the exciting news. Gravitational wave events in general are very hard to detect. Basically, what we're detecting are very, very small mirror distortions at any of these facilities caused by the gravitational wave that comes in. And so they're already really hard to detect. They require insane precision. And so it's useful to have multiple facilities confirm a gravitational wave event so that we can be more confident that it was a real detection and not just noise affecting the system. Because again, it's a very small mirror distortion. So even a little bit of noise could present itself as a gravitational wave event. And if we have multiple telescopes confirming this, then we feel more secure saying that it was a real event. So recently, early 2020, on January 5th, there were some signals at the Louisiana facility for LIGO and also Virgo. The reason there wasn't a signal at the Washington LIGO facility was because they were temporarily offline. And these signals were traced back to a 9 solar mass black hole colliding with a 1.9 solar mass neutron star. Because the signal to noise at the Virgo observatory was pretty low, they weren't really able to nail down the location of where this merger was coming from, but it's very exciting nonetheless. And then 10 days later, on January 15th, 2020, there were signals detected at both LIGO locations and Virgo. And this one had better signal to noise and more locations. So we were able to figure out that it was the merging of a 6 solar mass black hole and a 1.5 solar mass neutron star. And it's really hard to pin down where these are coming from, but we were looking in the sky for any sorts of corresponding lights, but we didn't find any. So we were able to narrow down the location slightly, but still didn't really pinpoint a location on the sky where this was coming from. The reason it's in this month's Astronomy in the News is that these detections were finally published just a few weeks ago. So that's very exciting. As you can imagine, with such precise measurements and the possibility for noise interfering, it takes a long time to confirm these merger candidates and do all the science necessary to just get all the information from it. So those were published, and it's a very exciting result. I mentioned that they did look for flashes of light in the sky that might be corresponding to either of these mergers. There were no flashes found, but this is really not surprising because a black hole neutron star merger would be very far from us. So any light would be extremely faint, but it's possible that the black holes just swallowed the neutron star's whole anyway, so there wouldn't even be light to detect in the first place, even if it were close. The LIGO Virgo Kegra network has other neutron star black hole merger candidates, but these two from early 2020 are the first to be confirmed. So it's very exciting that we're finding actual mergers of neutron stars and black holes for the first time. Here we have a very, very colorful artist's interpretation of what a neutron star black hole merger might look like. It's definitely not what we would see by eye, but it's pretty to look at. And so, yeah, we can just be excited that we have some confirmed detections of neutron star black hole mergers for the first time ever. That's it for Astronomy on Tap or news for July.
Thank you, Brianna. And also thanks for the drink. This is definitely one of the most unique cocktails we've had so far for AOT. As Steve said, make sure that you have your trivia answers in by the end of Astro in the News, so by now, because he's going to start grading those to reveal the answers and decide the winner after our next talk. So our next talk is going to be Kyle Batra. So Kyle, if you're ready, could you share your screen and get your video on? Awesome. So Kyle just graduated from Penn State last spring with a degree in astronomy and astrophysics, and he is starting his PhD at Purdue this coming fall. Is that right, Kyle?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. All right. Everything looks good, so I will let you take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. As I was just introduced, my name is Kyle Batra. I am a PhD student now at Purdue, starting in the Earth and Planetary Science Department this next fall. But I just recently graduated from Penn State with an astronomy and astrophysics degree, as well as minors in astrobiology and physics. And my research was actually in the geoscience department at Penn State with Dr. Bradford Foley, looking at planet interior evolution and how planet interiors affect the habitability of planets. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about my senior thesis, which is now becoming a paper, the scaling laws for stagnant lid convection with a buoyant crust, excuse me. So to begin, the first big research question that we began with when I started my freshman year was, what makes a planet habitable? And in turn, what makes an exoplanet habitable? Well, an exoplanet is just like a planet in our solar system, except it's outside of our solar system orbiting a different star. So when we're looking at these planets, we look at Earth and we're seeing what makes life on Earth habitable primarily. And we know that water is the most important thing for life on Earth. We need liquid water to be in its liquid state, and therefore we have this habitable zone or Goldilocks zone, nicknamed range here, as you can see in the figure, where as long as the planet is in that zone for the type of star it's orbiting, it can have liquid water and meet that condition. There are also a lot of other biological conditions needed for life to develop. We know on Earth there was this melting pot, essentially, or stew of amino acids and proteins that slowly formed and began life on Earth. And we don't fully know the process of that, but that's how the theories go. But so we know there needs to be the certain materials and elements on the planet to begin life. But there is one other part that we don't really talk about as much, and that's what I was investigating with my research, is what about planet interiors and what about planet evolution? How does that affect the habitability of the planet? So to start out, I want to introduce you all to this carbonate silicate cycle. The carbonate silicate cycle is this negative feedback loop cycle that actually regulates the temperature of planets over hundreds of thousands to millions of years, maintaining planet temperatures during those times. This cycle actually actively fights against temperature extremes, so it'll prevent Earth's temperature, for example, because it operates on Earth, from getting too hot or getting too cold. And this is through a carbon dioxide cycle, through volcanism, which is active volcanoes, as well as weathering of carbon dioxide back into the Earth and then subducting in plate boundaries. So volcanoes will release carbon dioxide while the weathering absorbs carbon dioxide. And the way this cycle works is when the Earth or a different planet gets too hot, the weathering rate that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere will increase and become faster than the carbon dioxide released by volcanism, leading to a decrease in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the planet to cool down. And if a planet gets too cold, it'll start to ice over, like we've had a couple times in Earth's history. And when that happens, weathering slows down and actually begins to stop, while volcanism continues to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which will then cause a greenhouse effect, heating up the planet again and warming up the planet. While this is great to maintain planet temperatures over like hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years, this sadly is not a very useful mechanism to maintain planet temperatures now when we have human-caused climate change, because the humans are affecting planet temperatures on a much shorter time frame than this negative feedback loop operates over. But the main conclusion of the carbonate silicate cycle is that it does require volcanism. So we need to learn more about a planet's interior and how that operates to learn if the carbonate silicate cycle could operate on any given planet. I also want to talk a little bit about the distinctions between Earth and Mars, because Mars is our fourth planet in our solar system. And it's interesting because it also had a very wet history. Both Mars rovers and satellites orbiting Mars have demonstrated that there used to be abundance of water on Mars. The rovers have detected it in soil and craters that used to be lakes. We've also photographed eroded river deltas that were eroded by water in the past. However, in other areas, Mars is very different than Earth. It's a lot smaller of a planet, and its interior is cooled down because it's smaller. And it's a lot further from our sun. It is actually at the edge of the habitable zone while Earth is inside of it. So liquid water has a much harder difficulty of remaining a liquid. But the one other difference about Mars' interior composition is that it is actually a stagnant lid planet, not a tectonic plate planet. So what is a stagnant lid planet? A stagnant lid planet, which is what my research is on, is planets that have one lithospheric lid that covers the entire planet. It doesn't have tectonic plates like Earth does that move around and create the continents that we see on Earth. Instead, there's one complete lid that that has no subduction, and the mantle operates distinctly below this top lid. We also believe that Venus has a stagnant lid. We don't actually know why Earth has a tectonic plates while Mars and Venus have stagnant lids. There's theories about the composition of water in the crust versus the mantle, leading to the formation of stagnant lid versus plate tectonics. But since we aren't actually sure, and there's been a lot of research done on this, we have to consider that exoplanets could be more abundantly stagnant lid planets, or could more abundantly be plate tectonic planets, and we don't know for sure. So we need to, when considering exoplanets and looking for habitable planets outside of our solar system, we need to consider that they could have a stagnant lid as well. And because of that, we need to do research and understand how stagnant lid planets operate. Now that we know that exoplanets could be stagnant lid planets like Mars, the question then becomes, could these stagnant lid planets be habitable? Could volcanism occur and cause the carbonate silicate cycle to operate on these planets? And looking at Earth, we see that the majority of volcanism happens, for example, on this ring of fire and in other plate boundaries between where tectonic plates meet. And this is caused by the crust being a lot near plate boundaries, and also the collisions leading to earthquakes and also volcanoes being created. For example, all across the western side of the US. However, there are places on Earth, like the Hawaiian hotspot, for example, that are not on a plate boundary and still have volcanism. And these are areas where the hotspot beneath in the mantle was so hot that it was able to melt through the crust and then create volcanoes that way. And that's how we expect volcanoes to happen on stagnant lid planets like Mars. Mars never had tectonic plates, yet we have Olympus Mons, which is the big volcano right here, and is actually the biggest mountain in the entire solar system. And as well as these Tharsis Montes right here are additional volcanoes that occur on Mars. So while volcanism can still happen on stagnant lid planets, it is a little bit more difficult because it has to be hotter and kind of dig through some crust to actually create the volcanism. So my research began looking at how stagnant lid planets operated and how they evolved. However, there'd been plenty of previous research on stagnant lid planets in the past. This research kind of modeled how their mantles operated, and the main conclusion is that these stagnant lid planets will have an active interior and volcanism where they're going to be volcanically active for a shorter amount of time. So I first actually pulled up a model that I created to demonstrate how the melting point of these different planets differs. So a stagnant lid planet will have a crust that grows over time because tectonic plates will be colliding on a tectonic plate planet and limit the growth of those crusts, while a stagnant lid planet will just compound over time and become thicker and thicker and thicker independently of the mantle beneath it. So over time, the temperature needed in a stagnant lid planet to melt through and create volcanism increases, which you can see in the blue line being the interior temperature of a stagnant lid Earth-sized planet, while the yellow line being the melting temperature needed for a stagnant lid planet to actually have volcanism. And that only allows volcanism to happen for about 5 billion years before the interior of the planet cools down to a point where it cannot melt through the crust anymore. However, a planet with tectonic plates requires a much lower temperature to have volcanism because the crust can be thinner at plate boundaries. And we find that an Earth-sized planet, so essentially Earth, could be active in this very simplified model for 10 billion years, which is important to note because 5 billion years is still enough time for life to develop and for a planet to be habitable. But tectonic plate planets are definitely can remain habitable for longer than a stagnant lid planet. Other things that the previous research had modeled included looking at the interior properties of the mantle. For example, the convective versus conductive heat transfer rate, also known as the Nusselt number, the interior temperature of the mantle, the viscosity, and the buoyancy-driven flow, also known as the Rayleigh number. So using this previous knowledge on stagnant lid planets, I began producing models of mantle evolution to learn and try to improve our understanding of how stagnant lid planets operate, and learn more about how long these planets can be habitable, and kind of create more precise boundaries on the habitability of these planets. However, in this research, we discovered a new regime that had not been explored yet in these stagnant lid planets. Essentially, when people had been modeling stagnant lid planet mantle evolutions, they had been running mantle convection models, as you can see here are some of mine, with the crustal boundary being the upper boundary of their 2D or 3D models. Well, in reality, as I mentioned, the stagnant lid will grow thicker and thicker over time. So you actually have to include the thickness of the crust in your models. And while the thickness of the crust does not actually impact the mantle when the crust is small, like, for example, the way the mantle operates when there is no crust and when there's a very small crust is almost identical. The thicker the crust becomes, we actually notice the crust does impact the properties of the mantle. And the mantle interior properties, for example, the way heat flux operates, the lithosphere thickness, interior temperature, the Nusselt number, they are all dependent on the crust thickness when the crust becomes thick. So we defined this new regime that had not been defined by previous research as a thick crust limit. And the research that had been previously done as the thin crust limit, where the crust doesn't impact convection. But we needed to explore this new thick crust limit more to determine how this regime that hadn't been explored before would affect the planet evolution, and if it was relevant at all. So just to demonstrate, first of all, what the thick crust limit is versus the previous research's thin crust limit, or the previously studied thin crust limit. When the crust does not impact the convection of a mantle, we found this steady trend of, for example, Nusselt number versus crust thickness almost being a flat line. And this flat line is the is the thin crust limit, where the crust does not impact the mantle's properties. But when the crust becomes sufficiently thick to impact the mantle beneath it, the Nusselt number crust thickness relationship trend completely diverges, and you have this separate line right here that dips down. And that is the thick crust limit, which had not been modeled before. So we collected a lot of data modeling different conditions of stagnant lid planets to kind of understand what the resulting Nusselt numbers would be regarding, and internal temperatures would be based on the properties of the mantle and the crust. And from those, we were able to learn more about how this thick crust limit would operate. We found that no matter what the buoyancy number of the crust, as long as the crust would be positively buoyant and float on the mantle, it could be partially buoyant with some floundering, or fully buoyant. No matter what it is, it would follow the exact same properties for Nusselt number and internal temperature compared to the crust thickness of the model. And as expected, the thicker crust would lead to more models in the thick crust limit. Excuse me. So what we then did is we took the previous theory of the thin crust limit, and we devised a new scaling law that encompassed both the previous scaling law for the thin crust limit and also added the thick crust limit's relationship to that scaling law. And by combining both those two scaling laws together, we were able to produce a more accurate prediction of how a mantle would operate, whether the crust was impacting or not. For example, the newly developed theory that I created was very accurate when a planet was in the thick crust limit, but the previous theory that had been developed by many researchers before me had been more precise for when the crust is thin and doesn't impact the mantle. And when you combine my theory and their theory together and essentially take the optimum result from either scaling law, we get this one-to-one prediction versus observed Nusselt number, as well as one-to-one predicted versus observed internal temperature, showing that our newly developed scaling laws are more precise and better at predicting the interior properties of the mantle than had been developed before me. So now that I have these scaling laws and can actively predict how a planet's going to operate and when it's a stagnant planet, we then need to look at, okay, is this thick crust limit even feasible? Are we going to observe this on exoplanets or Mars, for example? And what we found is that this thick crust limit is feasible, and you could see it on Mars and potentially an Earth-sized planet. We found that when the internal temperature of the mantle is higher and the reference viscosity is lower, you are more likely to enter into this thick crust limit. For example, anywhere below this eclogite forming limit on the Mars-sized planet would enter the thick crust limit. The eclogite limit is when the crust becomes so dense it drips off into the mantle. But anywhere below this eclogite limit dotted line, you could actually have a planet enter the thick crust limit. From this, we can see that a Mars-sized planet has a little more area where it could enter into the thick crust limit than an Earth-sized planet. So this thick crust limit theory would not be as relevant to super Earths that are multiple times the size of Earth. But for an Earth-sized planet or anything smaller than an Earth-sized planet, the thick crust limit would be relevant and could potentially be a regime that those planets enter if they are stagnant lit. Now that we know that the thick crust limit is feasible, the next thing we worked on was analyzing how the heat flux operated on these stagnant lit planets that were in the thick crust limit. And what we found is that when the crust was thick and impacted convection below it, it actually suppressed the heat flux for longer than stagnant lit planets that were in the thick crust limit. And because of that, the interior of the planet remained hotter for longer. So from all this, the main conclusions of my paper were that we developed a new scaling law for the thick crust limit that made improved previous research in stagnant lit planets and was more precise at modeling these planets than anything before. We found that the thick crust limit impacted convection, the interior temperature, and the Newton number of these planets, and was more likely to happen when a planet had a lower viscosity or higher internal temperature, or if the planet was smaller. Those were the conditions needed to enter the thick crust limit. And finally, the thick crust limit would actively impact the planet by causing a lower heat flux out of the planet over time, but leading to higher internal temperatures for longer inside that planet. And the main conclusion from this paper in regards to planet habitability is that this new thick crust limit regime that we developed and found that could occur in these stagnant lit planets could allow a stagnant lit planet to remain active for longer than a stagnant lit planet that never entered the thick crust limit. And if a planet is internally active and hotter for longer, it means that the planet can have volcanism, have active volcanoes for longer, which means the carbonate silicate cycle could operate on these planets for longer. And therefore, the planet could potentially be habitable for longer. Now, looking at this research and learning about how these planets can be habitable is relevant for the future because NASA and other companies and other space agencies are developing more and more telescopes looking at exoplanet detection in the future. For example, the James Webb Space Telescope, ELT, and the potential telescopes like LUVOIR and HABEX will be able to look at exoplanets more precisely than ever before. And these future telescopes will actually be able to perform atmospheric spectroscopy, where when a planet transits in front of its host star, we can look at the starlight that travels through the exoplanet's atmosphere and learn both about the planet's atmosphere, its interior, and potentially if it is habitable. So that's where my research has come from for the past couple of years, trying to model how these planets with a completely different interior structure than Earth does could be habitable. So thank you all for coming, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle.
No problem.
So yeah, folks can keep asking questions in the chat. I will kick this off with a clarifying question of my own. So in your conclusions, you talked about how planets entering the thick crust limit and maintaining a higher internal temperature is generally positive for habitability. Are there any situations in which this could be detrimental for habitability?
Yeah. So while in general, obviously having a planet that's going to be volcanically active is important to regulate the planet temperature. You could have a planet that's too geologically active. Venus, for example, is way too hot of a planet. It's too close to our sun. But Venus is also known to have rapid resurfacing every, I think, couple 100,000 years, where there's a volcano buildup, and then the entire planet completely resurfaces, which would be pretty detrimental to life. So you want to have this balance of having volcanoes, but also not completely like damaging the planet in any way.
Okay, awesome. You mentioned at the start there that we think Venus is a stagnant lit planet, but I think we aren't sure. Is there a possibility that these upcoming Venus missions are going to elucidate that?
Yeah, one of the difficult parts of Venus is we haven't been able to send a lot of probes or research to Venus. It's kind of hard to look through Venus's atmosphere and get any data on its interior. And while I don't think the Venus's interior is the main topic of any of the missions, there's going to be so much we learn about the planet that you can kind of extrapolate and potentially learn more about the planet's interior from those missions.
Okay, cool. So one question from the chat then. If there's an exoplanet that has a non-circular orbit, does a higher eccentricity impact how the crust and mantle will react based on different tidal forces over the course of the orbit?
Yeah, tidal forces could definitely impact how the interior mantle convex, because if depending on how a planet stretches and kind of retracts, it could impact how convection occurs. I haven't done any research on severe elliptical orbits, but that could be a potential research in the future. I don't think it would be a major impact to like affecting if a crust is tectonic plates or stagnant lid, because we see in Earth and Mars's orbits are pretty circular and have the two different regimes. But there would definitely be some impacts on a planet's interior if you had a highly elliptical orbiter, for example.
Okay. So I guess following from that, the astronomers know that in some cases planets' orbits can change in their eccentricity and go from circular to elliptical or vice versa.
Yeah.
So in that vein then, is it possible that for a planet like Mars that has a stagnant lid right now, could it one day have tectonic plates? Or for the Earth, could it go from tectonic plates to a stagnant lid?
Yeah. Again, this is one of the big mysteries in geoscience is why does Earth have tectonic plates and why Mars doesn't? So this is a big question that's being investigated a lot, and we aren't fully sure the answer. Mars will never get tectonic plates anymore because its interior has cooled down to a point that, while there could be some mantle convection, you're not going to have any volcanism. It's essentially a cool planet. You don't have any geothermal activity anymore. Earth, I don't know how there could be a way for Earth's interior to become stagnant lid, but then again, these crustal operations are not very understood. There are theories that Earth started out as a stagnant lid planet and then transitioned to become a tectonic plate planet. I think one of the prominent theories is that all planets start as stagnant lid and there's something that can cause tectonic plates to develop. But there are also other theories that the water quantity in the crust versus mantle is what causes tectonic plates versus stagnant lids to develop. How active its mantle is could impact tectonic plates. Like if an early planet there was a big line of volcanism that was actually enough to completely split the crust in an area, that I think that's one of the potential theories. But it's very difficult to say if a transition could occur, because it's one of those it's one of the big science topics in geoscience that we don't fully understand.
Cool. Well, glad to know there's still more to learn then. So I have one final question for you here. Do moons in the solar system or in other systems fall into the same distinctions of stagnant lid versus plates, or is that just an entirely different arena?
Yeah, it's kind of difficult because a lot of the moons are pretty small and not very active. But this kind of goes back to the tidal force question. We do actually see some of the icy moons orbiting Jupiter and Saturn displaying some sort of geologic activity due to tidal forces. And we believe that, and you can actually see some crust, like cracking of the upper like boundary of some of these icy moons due to the tidal forces. But I think we're looking at Enceladus. We believe that Enceladus has a stagnant lid beneath its ocean, which is because Enceladus has a subsurface ocean that essentially covers the entire moon. And directly below that is a silicate layer, and we think that's a stagnant crustal layer. But the inside of that is internally heated, and you get like volcanism through that heats up the water.
Super cool. All right. Thank you, Kyle. I don't think we have any more questions. So
No problem.
yeah, great talk. Thanks for coming in, and
Thank you.
we hope best of luck with your PhD program.
Thank you.
So, Steve, do you want to come on now and share the trivia answers?
Yep, sure thing. Just share my screen. Alrighty. So like Arvin just said, I'll go through the trivia answers, and then at the end, I'll reveal what team was our winner. If you won, we'll get in contact with you to figure out sending you a prize. But thank you to everyone for playing. We had a bunch of great contributions and answers all around. So our first question was about Jules Verne from the Earth to the Moon. The answer was he put the launch site for his mission to the moon at Florida, which is kind of prophetic because that is where the Apollo missions also launched to go to the moon. Launch sites closer to the equator can use the spinning of the Earth to get a little boost to help them get up into orbit. The second question, the inventor and engineer who developed the first liquid fuel rocket was Robert Goddard. He's pictured here to the right, and one of NASA's facilities is named after him. The third question, the program that helped take German scientists and move them to the US to work at the space program was called Operation Paperclip. 1,600 scientists were thus moved, one of which was Wernher von Braun, who I mentioned in the next question. Wernher von Braun's most controversial thing was his use of slave labor at concentration camps. During the war and before World War II, he was a pretty high up member of the Nazi Party. So his past is certainly very checkered, and his legacy has been criticized since. Sergei Korolev, the counterpart in the Soviet space program, however, spent the war years imprisoned in a Gulag labor camp. He was accused of sabotaging military engineering and sentenced to death, but his sentence was thankfully commuted. The R7 ICBM with the Korolev cross shown here has been in service for almost 70 years now. Today it flies under the name of Soyuz. It's used to launch Russian astronauts and other astronauts to the International Space Station. This is the longest serving type family of rockets in the world. The Mercury Redstone 1 mission got all of 4 inches off the ground. The rocket ignited, got 4 inches off the ground, and then settled back onto the launch pad. A few minutes later, the launch escape system went off, and then they just left the rocket on the launch pad until all the fuel boiled off. No one was hurt during it. It was an uncrewed flight, but it was a bit embarrassing for the rocket to get only 4 inches off the ground. The first vertebrate, the first large animal sent into space on Sputnik 2 was a dog named Laika. Unfortunately, Laika perished in space, although she certainly paved the way for many other animals and humans after her. Sally Ride was the first LGBT astronaut to go to space, which is a historic first besides just being the first American woman to go to space. Many people think she was the first woman, period, to go to space, but the Soviet Union sent Valentina Tereshkova to space almost 20 years earlier. this is a particularly stirring story. Yuri Gagarin thought the Soyuz spacecraft was error-prone and certainly deadly, and he knew the Soviet Union leadership would not let him, a national hero, the first human in space, risk his life on it. So he tried to kick Vladimir Komarov off the flight using his prestige. But Vladimir Komarov, even though he knew the spacecraft was dangerous as well, refused to let Gagarin take his place. And Soyuz 1 suffered hundreds of errors and eventually led to the death of Vladimir Komarov upon his return to Earth. All of these projects were true collaborations between American and Soviet or Russian programs, except the Gemini Salyut Rendezvous program. All three of the other ones were major achievements, both in international relations and paving the way to our international space program today. The Buran space shuttle, pictured here, though visually similar to our own American space shuttle, had numerous distinct features, but eventually it was canceled because the Soviet Union collapsed along with the economy of the former Soviet republics, and funding instantly dried up for both the space plane, the Buran space plane, and the Energia rocket, which it rode upon. In '65, John Young was reprimanded for bringing a corned beef sandwich with him on his mission. Though I'm sure it was delicious, there was a lot of worry about the crumbs flying off the sandwich, getting into sensitive electronics, and causing a disaster. So he was strongly reprimanded for that. All of these are traditions that astronauts partake in when they launch from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, except for attending a mass at a Russian Orthodox church. However, an Orthodox priest does often bless the astronauts and the rocket itself before it launches. And our final question, the second crew of Skylab left a joke for the third, which were mannequins dressed in flight suits. And according to the testimony of one of the astronauts on the third crew, they were scared out of their wits, thinking the station had been taken over. So those were our trivia results. Thank you all for playing very much. Let me congratulate the team named Jeffrey Bezos owes me a space flight. Whoever chose that team name, I certainly agree. I think he owes me a space flight too. Honorable mentions to the Langley lads and Darker Matter, our runner-ups and great team names all around. So thank you for playing, and we'll see you next time for more Astro Trivia. Back to you, Arvind.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So thanks everybody for tuning in, joining us tonight, and participating in the trivia and the Q&A. We will hopefully be back next month. We are still trying to figure out whether we will be able to be in person at Happy Valley Brewery or whether we will continue to be virtual for one more event. If this does turn out to be our last virtual event, thank you so much to everybody that's been tuning in from all over the country or even over the world. I don't know if we have any international fans yet, but thank you so much for supporting us. We do hope to be in person soon, though, to be a little bit more accommodating for our State College friends. With that, thanks everybody, good night, and I hope to see you all next time.